This is Hypnotic Stories, episode 2.4, titled Cut from Whole Cloth, in which I interview Mercedes Herman.
Hypnotic Stories is your treasure trove of hypnotic storytelling for change work and self-improvement. Here is your host, Master Storyteller James Hazlerig.
All right, Hypnotic Stories podcast listeners, this is James Hazlerig, and I'm here with two of my favorite creatures in the entire universe. One is my cat, who has curled up on my chest, and you might hear her purring a bit. Hopefully you won't hear any hissy fits or anything like that. And one of my other favorite people in the world is Mercedes Herman. She's a fantastic storyteller from New York City. I know New Yorkers get into what part and all of those details, but I'm from Texas. It's all one place to me. I met her a couple of years ago at HypnoThoughts Live, sat in and listened to her presentation, and she just smoothly went from nested loop to nested loop, and I was just blown away on the journey that she took us on. She's written a book of her stories, which, if I remember right, is called Mercy Speaks. Is that right?
No, that's Have Mercy.
That's Have Mercy. I'm sorry. And Mercy Speaks. Right. Mercy Speaks is actually the guided meditations for change and healing. It's funny, this morning on Facebook, it popped up my memory of when I first listened to those, and I had put on her sleep meditation. My wife had to tell me what it said, because all I really remembered was Mercedes saying, "Take a deep cleansing breath." And after that, I was out. So I'm really excited to have Mercedes Herman here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm always curious as to how people got started in storytelling.
Well, storytelling for me was a natural, because that's how my whole family spoke. It's always, if you've read any of my Good Night, Dear Friends, it's always about the mothers, the uncles, and everything always started as a story. They would come into the house, do their greetings and hello, and then it would start off, well, did you hear about so-and-so? Do you know what's going on? And then it would go on to a story, and then somebody would remember an incident that happened maybe 10, 20 years ago, and they would weave it into that story. I learned very early as a child that if I kept quiet and didn't put my 2 cents in, I could sit and listen to all these stories. And occasionally, after they saw that I would listen, they would add me and they would say, well, I had various nicknames, and usually it would be, baby, do you remember such and such and such? And I would say yes. And they said, well, what do you remember about it? And then I would tell them about what I remembered. And they would listen. And then the next time the story or the situation came up, they would call me and they would say, my nickname for them would be Meche, which is a variation of Mercy, of Mercedes. And then they would say, Meche, come and tell us the time that such and such. And because they like my story better than the story that I had. So that's how I basically got into storytelling, that always telling a story. And all our conversation always had a story to it. And a meaning. There was always a meaning about why something happened.
Wow. It's amazing to get to grow up in a culture of storytelling like that. That's really, really awesome. And I love that you note that there was always a meaning. There's always a message. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the cool things about hypnotic storytelling, is that really any good story has a message, and we want to convey those to our clients. So how do you use storytelling now?
I use storytelling now with clients and with anyone I speak to. One of the things about storytelling, how I use it now, I listen. Your unconscious always is trying to say this to the conscious world. Will somebody please listen to me? Something's going on. I need something. I listen really carefully, and all of a sudden I'll pick up on something, and I'll just start off with, one time I knew something, or and people have gotten used to me now that they'll say, Merce, give me a story. And I'll say, okay. And I noticed that even when I talk to people, I always imagine something more than what they're saying. So I can always see a story in someone. and in the situation. And I can always see where maybe the right word. I'm a big one for reading the Bible, and I love the Old Testament. And I'm not because of religious stuff, but because it has so much meaning. And usually I can match one of the heroes or heroines from the Bible to something that's happening in someone's life. The same way I read fables and I read legends, you can always find something to communicate, because as I always tell everybody, the conscious mind only knows 7 words. It only can hold 7. It can only hold 7 words.
Okay.
But the unconscious then all of a sudden says, oh, wait a minute. She's got something else to say, or he's got something else to say. And all of a sudden, they stop and they want to hear. The unconscious says, oh, talk to me. Let the conscious be busy with the 7 words that you gave them. And just talk to me.
Wow, that's neat. And there's so many great things in what you just brought up. One is that there's this amazing storehouse of stories that we have in fables and legends and mythology and religion. And really, when you think about it, religion is all based on stories.
Yes.
Then there's also that skill that you've developed, that you're listening to what someone else is saying, and you're finding that little thread that you're going to spin into a yarn.
Yes.
Yeah, because I've been trying to figure out what the heck it is that we're doing when we tell stories. I kind of grew up with a storytelling dad and had this, not quite, as big an extended family, but sort of a tradition of that. And then I started telling stories, and people were like, well, teach us how you do that. And I'm like, I don't know. And it's that thing that you mentioned, that we're on the lookout for stories. Yes. Yeah, cool. So I know that before you became a hypnotist, you spent a long time working as a nurse.
Yes, 40 years.
Wow. And I know every nurse I've ever met has some amazing stories about that experience. Are there times when you felt that as a nurse you were using your stories or being hypnotic with your patients?
Always. I did not know that I was being hypnotic. I learned early that a lot of times pain, things that the patient was going through, the regular sense of words was not enough. They were on a verge of going on a trance. And they needed to know that someone was going to allow them to go into that trance. And that was something that it took me many years. I can now say it now, but then I didn't know about it. I would notice that they needed to let go so that they could start to heal or start to hear. A lot of times the doctors would say to me, Merce, go in there. That patient is nuts. He doesn't want to hear anything I'm saying. And the patient be screaming, saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to take the medication. I don't want to. And I would look for that critical moment where I would listen to them, and then I would say, you want to take a deep breath now? Or I would say, can I touch your hand or your arm? And it'd always be, I always landed up getting the guys that weigh like 250 pounds, 6 feet tall, ready to rip up the room. And the doctors would say, cool, Merce will go in there and work. And I'd go in there and they'd look at me like, what are you supposed to be doing? And the minute I would find that one little, I call it that soft spot, as most hypnotists know, that spot just when I said they're ready to go off to the edge into trance, I could sit down and I could say, and then they would breathe with me, and you develop that rapport, and then they would say, I imagine now, they would probably go into that trance and they would say, I really am so scared. Oh, I really don't understand. I really would. And then I could sit down and I could, break down why we wanted to do the care for them, how we could do the care for them, why it was important for them to get the care, and how I really thought the best. I knew that they could get well and that we could make life much more livable. And I'd get these, like I said, I'd get these guys who were ripping up the rooms, tearing up stuff. And then they'd come out and I would say to them, I'm going to go and give you an injection. And they would say, okay. And I'd go in and that would be it. And they would say, they would call them mercy patients. They would say, okay. And they would say, that was a mercy patient. You can, deal with her. And I would get them back. They come back to clinic, they come back for care, or we would get them ready for surgery or whatever sedation. Because if you give them sedation on top of all that screaming and carrying on, you're shutting up the unconscious. And it took me, like I said, until I became a hypnotist, then I started to understand what it was.
Wow. That really reaffirms something that Michael Ellner teaches, which is that it's the relationship that heals.
Yes.
I'm guessing that there probably wasn't a moment in nursing school where they taught you how to do that. I could be wrong.
They had something called therapeutic touch that they taught in nursing school. And really it was like, your touch and you feel the aura. But because of the background that I came from, I knew that it was much more, that touch and words and tonality was much more. So when we would have classes and the teacher would always notice, she said, "Oh, you're really good at this." And they wanted to encourage me to work in psychiatry. And I said, because psychiatry used to suck out so much from me. I would come home from whatever clinical I had from psych, and I would have to literally lay in the bed with clothes on because they sucked the juice out of me, and I didn't know how to take care of myself then.
Right.
But you do in nursing. You're supposed to be the first and most important thing about nursing. You're supposed to be an advocate for your patient. You're supposed to fight for the care of your patient. In hypnosis, you're the advocate for your client.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be there for them. Yes, they come to you for whatever difficulties or problems they have, but they're not looking for you to beat them up. They're looking for you to say to them, "Look, I know you got this problem, and it sucks, and it's not the greatest thing in the world, but you know what? I'm here to listen, and I'm here to, with your unconscious, to make the road to get you out of that situation." And that's how basically I always worked in nursing. In nursing and in hypnosis, is that I'm the advocate for the patient or the client. I'm there for you. I'm going to do everything I possibly can do to help you.
That's such a wonderful attitude to take and such a great approach to working with people. You talked about that listening to them. A lot of hypnotists say, "Oh, I don't want to hear anything they have to say. I don't want to hear about their problems. I just want to get right in there and fix things for them." And while it's true, I know there's some clients who get caught in those loops where they just keep repeating everything that's wrong, and they've rehearsed it and they've perfected it. But at the same time, I think what you've just told us points out that need to listen to their story at least once. Because people need to get it out. We need that self-expression. Of course, you grew up in a fantastic setting where people were teaching you to be a storyteller.
And to be a saver of stories.
Yes, yeah, because every storyteller is a story collector.
Yes.
And so what advice do you have for people who didn't have the benefit of growing up in that kind of setting, but still want to use stories in their hypnotic and therapeutic work?
It's interesting. Someone asked me that the other day.
Mm-hmm.
They said to me, "How do I write stories or tell stories when I didn't come from a background like you?" And I said to the person, I said, "Tell me the first time that somebody gave you ice cream." And they sat down, they thought about it. And I said, "Can you remember the first time?" And they started to talk about the ice cream. And I said, "Well, who was there?" And they talked about this other person, and they talked about how their father took money out of his pocket. And at the end of the whole incident about the ice cream, I said, "You just have a remembrance." I said, "You have a culture." I said, "Sit down and remember various incidents that happened in your life." And I said, and give voice to it. Either voice in writing, voice in telling somebody else. Children love to hear you talk about in the old days.
Yes. Back when phones had dials.
Yes. Like my neighbor's little girl, she used to love when I used to go over how much milk costs. I don't know what it fascinated her with. She used to say, she would come knock on my door and say, we bought a gallon of milk and it was $2.75. I'm 7 years old. When you were 7 years old, how much did a gallon of milk cost? And then I sat and told her, I said, we didn't buy gallons, we bought quarts. And that fascinated her, that I would buy a quart, and she wanted to know, did the milk taste any different then? And this was a whole thing for her. Children love to hear, and other people like to hear. You're like in the olden days. That's how you start telling stories, and you start building up a remembrance of stories. And you'll be surprised that even though with the milk, when I used to do this whole little milk thing with her, I would come up talking about the cookies, the stuff, or talking about the fact, a time where my mother was pouring milk for me and she was crying. And I remember I can see little Erica saying to me, why was your mother crying? And I had to sit and think about it. And I said, I think I remember my mother thought that was she didn't have enough money for the next container of milk. And I said, and she wanted me to drink the milk and never wanted me to know that she might not be able to have milk for me the next day. And I said, and how much she loved me, and she wanted to make sure that I had milk. And she thought about it, and she said, well, what did she do to make sure you had milk the next day? And I said, my mother used to smoke. I said, my mother didn't buy cigarettes the next day to make sure I had that container of milk. So I hadn't even remembered that incident. And I think about it now, and I'm just so moved that my mother, who really enjoyed smoking, thought it was more important for me to have milk the next day.
Yeah, and I can see how I may well steal that story. Which that's the other thing we storytellers are, is we're thieves.
Liberate.
Yeah. Well. Share. We borrow. We propagate. Yes. You know, because that's the beautiful thing. When we steal a story, it's not taken away from the person who had it. But when people come to me to quit smoking, it's all about an identity level change. And very often I'll say to someone, you're no longer a smoker, you're a mother. Mm-hmm. And those two things are not congruent. They cannot go together anymore. And so that story is such a beautiful illustration of that. For people who are mystified by nested loops, I want to point out that we just had one. We had the story of the little girl, Erica. Right? And then we had the story of the little girl, Mercedes, and her mother inside that story, and then back to Erica. People are so mystified by nested loops, but they're really a pretty natural part of telling stories. So I like that advice about, when was the first time that someone gave you ice cream, and various remembrances, and just the way that we naturally are going to relate these stories. I was thinking about it recently, and considering that a lot of people who don't think of themselves as storytellers, if they've had a really lousy day and they get home and their spouse says, "How was your day?" instantly they become very good storytellers. Yeah. And first the traffic was like this, and oh my God, and there was this jerk who did this, and can you imagine? And I'm just sitting there, and then he zips right around, and they relive it. They are full of sensory detail and all that sort of thing. Your way is much kinder, probably, than getting people to remember a crappy day.
It's a good thing to talk about the crappy days. I'll share a joke. Mm-hmm. My mother, she used to write these letters, and she would get very upset. One day, she lost a subscription to some magazine, so she wrote them a letter. And the letter was just, she was so angry. She wrote it all up, and she told them that they were horrible people. Why did they miss her subscription? And then she said, and you treat prisoners better than this. So she always said, I sent you to college, so she said, I sent my daughter to college so she can review my letters. So I looked at the letter, and I said to her, well, Mommy, I could see that you're very upset about this. I said, but you really cannot send this. I said, you're not going to get a very good response with this letter. And she looked at me, and she said, well, that's why I sent you to school, so that you can look at this. So after that, it became the family joke that when you got angry about something, write a prison letter and then give it to somebody else to redo it. So I landed up redoing the letter, sending it in, and she got a 2-year subscription free. And the person said to me, would I mind being used for a story about this letter? And I said, sure. And my mother said to me, and my mother was very proud, she said, well, you know, my daughter went to college so that she could be able to read my letters.
That's great. I have served a similar function for my mother-in-law. Thanks. You've given some really great advice. I'm just curious, what is your experience like when you're telling a story? What's going on inside Mercy's head?
I kind of see a map.
Mm-hmm.
I can see when I'm telling the story, and especially when I'm focusing on the story, not just talking off the top of my head kind of thing. But when I'm focusing on that story, I'm seeing the present moment, and then I'm seeing where do I want to lead that story, and I can really start to see. And you just spark something in my own mind. I can see where the nested loops are. I can see and I don't say it in my mind as a nested loop, but I can say I can go this lane, I can go this trail, because sometimes I'm looking at the person who I'm telling the story to, and I'm looking for the response. And then I'm saying to myself, well, maybe if I go this lane, it's not going to meet that need. And I allow that person's unconscious, or even the audience's unconscious, to say to me, I need to hear a little bit more about something else. And then I'll put that in there. And that's basically when I'm doing the story. At night, when I'm doing my writings, I start off with a story in my mind, what I'm going to have. And then I'll sit down and I'm writing it, and all of a sudden, when you see the apprentice, sometimes we see the little apprentices that I put in the story, that's because I'm going into a new
Nice, yeah. And by the way, any listeners out there who don't know quite what we're talking about with Mercedes' nighttime stories or bedtime stories, I think of them. You should friend Mercedes on Facebook. I know I didn't ask you if I could tell them to do that, and every night she has a little story or a thought, then just says, kind of good night. And I know from conversations we've had, you said that's sort of your nighttime ritual. It's what you do before you can go to bed. But you told me some really funny things about that at HypnoThoughts and some of the people's reactions.
Okay. I have to say the reason why I do the good night, dear friends, is that when you're 3 years old, every child, and you can see any child, before they go to sleep, they go through their whole day. And they go step by step by the whole day. By time, that's how they learn languages, and that's just how basically they build up their vocabulary. Well, you stop at 4 or 5. I never stopped. I always, from the time of being 3, I've gone through my whole day, everything that's happened to me that day, and what I remember. So what I started doing was, I felt that my brain was getting clogged up. I started writing these things on Facebook, remembering memories. And I thought what was very interesting when I went to the convention this year, the HypnoThoughts Live, was people who came up to me and said, "Oh, are you Mercedes Herman?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Oh, I read you every night." I said, "Oh, that's really nice." I had all these people coming up. And then I jokingly said, well, it'd be nice if occasionally if you kind of gave me a click to let me know that I was just writing out in the world. And the person said, "Oh, I couldn't wait to HypnoThoughts because I wanted to meet you. I wanted to shake your hand." I said, "Well, thank you very much." I just started a new community. I'm in a new community, a cabaret community. Mm-hmm. And I went to a fundraiser, And, I came in and somebody said, "Hi, Merce, how you doing?" And this lady comes up to me. She said, "You're Mercedes Herman." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Oh," I said to my partner, "I'm going to this fundraiser for blah, 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 but I'm going to meet this Mercedes Herman. I hope she's there." And I said, "Oh," she said, "I read every night your stories." I said, "Well, that's really good." She says, "Occasionally I give you a click." But she said, "But you need to know I read it every night." I said, "Okay." She said, "And the other night you were late. It was 11:59 when you wrote." I said, "Oh, sorry."
I've noticed, too, that a lot of times people are listening far more than we know.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot more people out there responding to what we do than we realize. I think that's one thing all of us have to remember, that for every person that clicks, there's like another dozen who read it and just fell asleep immediately. Didn't even click.
Yeah, but it's true. I have a friend who we share the same birthday, and I'm 5 years older than she is, and she always treats me like I'm the baby. She's very, very nurturing, very protective, and not into hypnosis. She doesn't particularly care. She finds it all foo-foo and all that. But it's interesting. She always wants me to tell her a story. We go away, tell stories. So about a couple of weeks ago, we were talking on the phone, and she said, "Merce, do you remember when you told..." No, let me get it the right way. She says, "I just thought about you because I thought about that story you told me, blah, 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 blah." She was having some situation in her family life. And she says, "And I just thought about it, and I remember at the end of it." And she said, "Oh, yes, that gave me so much encouragement." And then she looked at me and laughed, and she said, "Well, I guess I believe in some of your hypnosis." And then she went and I remember that story. That was even before I started hypnosis. She would say to me, "Oh, tell me a story," or she would tell me, read me something out of the Old Testament and fix it up. In other words, doctor it up, make them just read something up. She would tell me and fix it up.
That's great. And every story is new every time it's told. Yeah. Even the oldest stories. A big part of the storyteller's art is recreating a story in a new and different way. In the class I taught back at Hypno Thoughts Live, I kind of stumbled onto, all right, so at like 5 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and rewrote the class. And I started thinking, it's like a salad. Because, you can go out to the garden, you can gather all your ingredients, or the refrigerator, or the grocery store, or the bodega, or wherever you get, your ingredients. I live in the country, so sometimes we get the privilege of going right out to the garden and gathering all these different ingredients. And you might say, "Man, that salad we had last night was really good." And you can try to recreate it exactly. But chances are you're going to get a little bit more spinach, maybe you don't quite have the same tomatoes you had the night before. You might mix up the dressing a little differently and think, what if I threw a little sriracha in there? And you're going to come up with all of these variants. So each and every time that the salad is created, it's a little different.
Yeah.
Something I'm kind of curious about. I know you have a vast storehouse of tales that you use. Do you ever make up a story just out of whole cloth to tell a client or a listener or a friend?
I have a pattern. How's that?
Okay.
I have a pattern. And the pattern is, let me see how I can cut this story to meet this person's need. And sometimes I have to, and I usually will start out with something with truth, something that I know for sure. Mm-hmm. And then from then on, I just continue on to see, looking at the client and looking at the person, how best for me to change this story around to meet their needs. And sometimes it's totally, even when I finish telling it, I'll say to myself, I said, "Damn, that was good." I like that.
Yeah. Do you ever have that moment where you're like, why wasn't I recording that story I just told that client?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll go like this. And I have to tell you, if you ever look on my phone, I have what I call a sentence page, word page. Mm-hmm. I'll hear a sentence or I'll hear a word. and I'll write it directly into that page. And I just leave it. Maybe you might have said something. I'm looking at it and I have something from you.
Okay.
When I first met you, you talked about the fact that you went to get the mail when you were little and you were barefooted and the heat in Texas was so hot that you had to get the mail quick and run back to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And I put that down in the page as the hot sidewalk and feet, James' feet.
Yeah.
Never know when I might have to use that or leave it.
Right.
I have that page, and it's a muse for me. Just a word, maybe the way someone said it, or maybe just something, just 2 words or 1 word, or sometimes I'll see signs in the street and I'll write it in that part in my iPhone, and I'll look at it, and you can start a whole new story from just 2 words.
Yeah. So you have a bunch of ingredients in the freezer.
Yes, I do.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, so what you described is a little bit like, when you adapt those stories and you figure out how to cut it, how to extend it. It's almost like when you take a garment in to be altered.
Yes.
And they do those alterations. I was curious because I do a lot of alteration and very little creation of new garments from whole cloth. I have played around a little bit with creating a whole new story, and I'm always kind of excited. I'm like, oh wow, I came up with one. Look at that. It's kind of the same thing with like fiddle tunes. I play a bunch of fiddle tunes that other people created, and then every once in a while I'll create my own. So I'm always curious, but I think it points out something that, again, should be reassuring to those who are getting into hypnotic storytelling is you don't have to be a writer. You don't have to create a whole new story. You can take a story that already exists, and your memory is full of stories that already exist, and there are books full of stories, and I love the way that you take note of those little details of stories people have told you and ideas and phrases. I've really enjoyed picking your brain about this. I'm on a quest to understand storytelling better.
Now, you had said that you wanted to know if there's a new way of writing a story or making up something. And just recently, I saw a documentary about a man who had a wonderful shop, and he had all kinds. He sold cocktail dresses. He made all kinds of fancy dresses and everything. And he lost it. He said he no longer had that passion to do that anymore. And sometimes we have that, we do something so well for a long time and we get it down packed so well that after a while, sometimes we kind of just lose that passion for it. So he decided to close down his shop. He just said, I kind of lost my purpose, he said. And sometimes we kind of say to ourselves, oh, I just got to close down shop because I kind of lost the purpose for what I'm doing in life. And as he was cleaning up his shop, he started to notice he had all these little pieces of scraps of material that he had been saving. He never knew why. He just had it in a box, and he just always kind of just saved it. And as he continued to clean more and more of the stuff of the things that were so usual, the dress and everything, he noticed that there were more scraps. And before he decided to close the shop, he decided to go to a sewing machine and take all those pieces of scraps. And he started to put them together. And as he started to put them together, he started to notice that, oh, I don't have to put that piece of cloth there. Let me move it around. And then he noticed that as he put this cloth together, he cut it up again to see if he could match it in a different way. And sometimes we have to take those little scraps of our lives and some of those stories and those hurts and even those victories, and we have to put them together and sew them up together. And one of the beautiful things about it is that it's our story, it's our scraps. And some people would say, well, what can you do with scraps? And as he continued to put his scraps together and all kinds, he then said, oh, wait a minute. He decided to make a shirt. And he did. He had a pattern, and he had put all these scraps together and made it really a whole new piece of cloth and made a lovely shirt. And he was like, damn, this shirt is looking good. I like this. And he got on Instagram, took a picture of his shirt just to say, look at the shirt I made. And he started to get a lot of people who said to him, oh, you're now sewing unisex. Oh, I love that shirt. Could you make me one? Could you make me one? And he said, aha, new purpose. And he started to think about all his friends the people that he was going to let go who worked in his shop. He said to them, listen, let's make some new cloth. And the whole beauty of it was that everybody had an ability to take pieces of scraps, their scraps, and make a new cloth and make a new shirt, a blouse. Now, some people now in his store, you could go and you could buy one of his shirts. Or you may decide to say, what do you have there to make something that fits me? And he has people he takes out the scraps and he says, fix it. How do you like it? How would you like it made? And they fix it, they sew it, and within the day you can have a new blouse, a new shirt, whatever you want. And the person who makes it for you gets paid a good wage. But the real true beauty of this story is that he goes once a month to a factory that sews patterns, that sews clothing, and the scraps they throw away. And he said, can I take them? And they said, sure, you could take them for free. And he takes them back. He takes them with his friends and him. They go and they pick up enough scraps to make enough new cloth. And sometimes we have to take our lives and we have to go to other people and say, could you share your visions, your ideas, your love? Not scraps, because these are just bits of wonderful material. And you can sew them together. Some of your ideas and some of their ideas. And then you can make a whole new shirt. No one can really tell where the bit and piece was or the scrap was. All they know, it's now a whole new shirt. So sometimes we have to look at our lives and we have to just kind of clean out the closet. And those things that we think are really not very good or don't give us that passion and pizzazz, maybe we just need to cut it up and put it together again. There's a beauty in the fact that in the olden days, that those women would make those quilts of bits and scraps, and they could look at them and tell you a story about that comes from Betty's blue jeans, that's Jim Bob's blouse and shirt, or maybe that was Grandpa so-and-so's best Sunday shirt. Those little small memories that we have, we kind of put them on the side. So I would suggest to anyone, maybe you need to take some of those stories and start to put them together and to make a new cloth and to know that there's a new beginning and there's always a new way to have purpose.
Thanks for listening to the Hypnotic Stories podcast with James Hazlerig. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. For free storytelling tips, go to www.hypnotic-stories.com.